I'm nearing 30, and Christmas has lost a bit of its magic for me. These days, I usually make the trip to wherever my family is hosting that year, hang out for a few days, and then head back home. It's always nice to see everyone, but with so many relatives packed into one house, it can get overwhelming fast. Last year, to avoid the chaos, I decided to rent an Airbnb near my cousin's place. He lives out in the middle of nowhere, so most of the rental options were small cabins. I didn't overthink it and just booked one at random. A few days before Christmas, I packed up and drove out there. The first couple of days were great. I got to catch up with relatives I hadn't seen in years, and everything felt festive. But by Christmas Day, the house was bursting at the seams, around 30 people crammed into a 3-bedroom space. It was fun but exhausting. That evening after dinner, I decided to call it a night and head back to the cabin. It was around 7 p.m. when I left my cousin's place and drove the short distance back. The cabin was tucked away in the woods, just outside of town, and while it wasn't anything fancy, it was cozy enough for a few days. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed something odd. There were fresh footprints in the snow leading up to the front door. That struck me as strange since the cabin was pretty secluded, but I assumed it might have been the Airbnb host stopping by for some reason. As I walked up to the door, I saw that the footprints stopped at the front porch. It didn't look like anyone had gone inside. They must have knocked or waited briefly, then left. Shrugging it off, I went inside, tossed my jacket on the couch, and sat down in one of the chairs. I thought about texting the host to ask if he'd stopped by, but I figured if it were important, he would have reached out to me. I must have dozed off within a few minutes, because the next thing I knew, I was startled awake by the sound of the doorbell ringing. Still groggy, I got up and walked over to the door, trying to shake off the haze of sleep. When I opened the door, there was a man standing there. He had medium-length black hair and wore a brown jacket. With a friendly smile, he introduced himself as the Airbnb host and extended his hand for a handshake. Still half asleep, I went along with it, letting him lead the conversation while I just nodded and mumbled responses. He asked how my stay was going and mentioned that he needed to check on a few things in the cabin. Before I realized it, he'd stepped past me and walked inside. That was the moment I fully woke up, and a sinking feeling hit me. Something about this didn't feel right. He moved into the living room and stood there for a moment, looking around like he was inspecting the walls. But it didn't seem like he was actually looking for anything. He just seemed to be stalling. The realization that it was still Christmas Day made the whole situation feel even stranger. Why would the host need to do this now, of all times? Couldn't it have waited until tomorrow? Feeling increasingly uneasy, I finally spoke up. "Hey, do you think you could come by tomorrow instead? I've got some family coming over soon, so it's not really a good time right now." The man turned to face me, and his expression shifted. His smile disappeared, replaced by a stiff, almost angry look. Without saying a word, he casually walked back toward the front door. For a moment, I thought he was leaving, but then I heard the click of the lock as he turned the deadbolt. A surge of fear hit me, and I bolted for the bedroom, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. Seconds later, I heard him pounding on the door, trying to force it open. My mind raced as I realized my phone and car keys were still in my jacket, which was on the couch. I needed to act fast. Looking around the room, I spotted a small window at the back with a push-open latch. I ran over and started prying it open as the bedroom door behind me began to crack and splinter under the man's weight. I squeezed through the window and dropped into the snow outside, running straight for the tree line. As I glanced back, I saw him burst out of the front door, looking around wildly. Fortunately, the darkness and dense trees gave me plenty of cover, and he didn't seem to know where I'd gone. He stayed outside for what felt like forever, probably 20 minutes, before finally getting into his car and driving away. I waited a bit longer to make sure he was gone, then sprinted back to the cabin, grabbed my phone and called 911. When the police arrived, the real Airbnb host came as well and confirmed that he hadn't stopped by the cabin at all. After investigating, the police speculated that the man had figured out the cabin was being rented as an Airbnb and used that as a way to gain access. His exact intentions remain unknown, but it's safe to say he wasn't there to borrow a cup of sugar. That night was a close call, and it left me shaken for a long time. I've since learned to be a lot more cautious about who I trust, especially in isolated places. This year was the first time I'd ever spent Christmas alone. I know that probably sounds a bit depressing, but honestly, it wasn't too bad. I just couldn't afford the plane ticket back to my hometown, and I didn't have enough vacation days to make the trip worthwhile. To make the most of the day, I decided to stick with simple pleasures. I started off the morning watching the classic Grinch cartoon while enjoying a warm breakfast and some coffee. Then, I spent about an hour FaceTiming with my family, my parents and siblings. It was nice catching up, even if I couldn't be there in person. By the time all that wrapped up, it was probably around noon. I didn't have much planned for the rest of the day, but at one point I decided to head outside to grab the mail. That's when I noticed something odd. There were footprints in the snow on my porch. What was strange wasn't just that they were there, but that they were frozen solid, clearly not fresh. These weren't from that morning. They must have been made hours ago, probably overnight when the temperature was way below freezing. I glanced around nervously, but there was no one in sight. Feeling unsettled but unsure what else to do, I grabbed the mail and went back inside. I tried to shake off the weird feeling and keep myself busy. It was Christmas, after all, so I didn't want to dwell on anything negative. I put on some Hallmark movies and started opening the gifts and letters my family had sent me. By mid-afternoon, maybe around 3 p.m., I was starting to get bored. I checked the weather and saw it was supposed to get much colder later, so I figured I'd go for a quick walk around the neighborhood while it was still tolerable outside. I bundled up, stepped out, and started strolling along the sidewalks, admiring all the Christmas lights. The neighborhood was calm and quiet, but I did notice one other person walking nearby. They were on the opposite side of the street, and at first I didn't think much of it. But not long after passing them, I saw them again walking toward me from the opposite direction. I blinked, confused. There was no way they could have doubled back so quickly unless they had turned around immediately after we passed each other. It felt strange, but I told myself it was probably nothing and kept walking. Soon I reached a point where I could either keep exploring the neighborhood or head back home. For some reason, I decided to head back. It wasn't just the strange encounter with the other walker, something about the atmosphere felt off. When I got back home and stepped inside, I had barely taken off my boots when I heard a knock at the door. My heart leapt. It felt too soon, like whoever was at the door must have been waiting for me. I hesitated, then peered through the peephole. There was a man standing right outside, his baseball cap pulled low over his face. Something about him felt familiar, but I couldn't place it. At first, I thought it was just the guy I'd seen walking earlier. He knocked again, harder this time. My stomach churned. "What do you want?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't respond. Instead, he banged on the door again, harder and louder. Then, without warning, he grabbed the doorknob and started shoving his weight against the door. The whole thing rattled as he tried to force his way in. I stumbled back, my heart racing. It felt like the door could give way at any second. But then, suddenly, everything stopped. There was a moment of silence, and then I heard shouting voices yelling commands outside. I ran to look out the peephole again and saw 2 police officers outside. They were arresting the man at my door. I was stunned. I hadn't called them, so how had they shown up so perfectly in time? Later, I found out that one of my neighbors had called the police. They'd noticed the man acting suspiciously, pacing up and down the street for hours and standing outside my house for an unsettling amount of time. But the scariest part came later, when I learned who he was. It turned out he was an ex-boyfriend from 6 years ago, someone I hadn't spoken to since our breakup. He didn't even live in the same state as me anymore. The police found 2 knives on him, and in his car parked a few blocks away, they discovered a firearm and a roll of duct tape he'd recently purchased. He refused to explain himself, but it wasn't hard to guess what he had been planning. To this day, I can't stop thinking about how lucky I was that my neighbor had called the police. That Christmas could have ended very differently. I had spent most of Christmas morning and afternoon with my family, and by the time evening rolled around, it was time to head home and relax. I wasn't planning anything special, maybe just watch a holiday movie and unwind. The drive home took about 45 minutes, and the roads were eerily empty, as you'd expect on Christmas night. If it hadn't been for the holiday spirit lingering in the air, the stillness and silence outside might have felt unsettling. Everything was so still, like the world had paused for the day. I got home around 8 p.m., pulled into the garage, and headed inside. As I stepped through the door and turned on the light, I immediately noticed something odd. There were papers scattered across the hallway floor. It was all from a stack of mail I had left on the counter. I figured it must have fallen over somehow. Maybe I'd bumped it in the rush to leave earlier that morning and didn't notice. Shrugging it off, I gathered the papers and put them back on the counter. After that, I started turning on lights as I walked through the house. Eventually, I made it to the living room, where my little slightly pathetic artificial Christmas tree sat in the corner. It wasn't much, but it added a bit of festive charm to the space. I settled onto the couch and found a new Christmas movie on Netflix to watch. It wasn't bad, actually pretty entertaining, but as the movie played, I kept hearing faint creaks around the house. At first, I wasn't sure if I was really hearing them or if it was just my imagination. Every time I thought I heard something, I'd pause the movie and listen intently. But as soon as I stopped the movie, the noises would stop too. I convinced myself it was nothing, probably just the house settling or the wind outside. When the movie ended, I decided it was time to call it a night. Spending all day with family had left me pretty drained. I turned off the TV, switched off the lights downstairs, and headed upstairs to my bedroom. As soon as I walked into my room and flipped on the overhead light, I froze. Something was off. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it, but the longer I stood there, the more certain I became things in my room weren't how I'd left them. Something had been moved. My stomach dropped as I thought back on everything else that had seemed strange since I got home: the scattered papers, the faint noises. My heart started racing and a wave of fear and adrenaline washed over me. I stepped out of the bedroom and looked down the staircase, straining to hear anything. The house was utterly silent. "Is anyone here?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've already called the cops." But as the words left my mouth, I realized my mistake. I hadn't called the cops yet. I decided I needed to get back to my room, lock the door, and make the call immediately. As I turned to head back upstairs, I heard footsteps rushing out of the living room. My breath caught as I saw a figure dart past the Christmas tree, the branches swaying from their movement. Frozen in place, I could barely process what was happening. The figure bolted into the kitchen, threw open the back door, and disappeared into the night. Once they were gone, I finally snapped out of my daze. I rushed to lock the back door and immediately called 911. When the police arrived, they searched the house but didn't find anything or anyone. As far as I could tell, nothing was missing, at least not anything obvious. After piecing things together, my best guess is that the intruder broke in sometime before I got home. When they heard the garage door open, they probably panicked, scattered the papers, and hid somewhere in the house. What really haunts me, though, is the thought that they might have been hiding the whole time I was watching that movie. Were they in the living room, just a few feet away, silently watching me? Or were those faint noises I kept hearing something else entirely? To this day, I don't have answers. The police couldn't do much since there wasn't much evidence to go on. Nothing else has happened since then, and I hope it stays that way. But the memory of that night and the thought of what could have happened still sends chills down my spine.